What's up, guys? It's Mark with another episode of the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast. Today, I sit down with Mike Shelby, founder of the Forward Observer and the Early Warning Network, to discuss the growing fractures within America's ruling class and the potential for civil conflict. As a former military intelligence analyst, Mike breaks down the dynamics between intra-elite competition, how it fuels instability, and what warning signs we should be watching for. We also dive into the historical parallels, the role of information warfare, and how ordinary Americans can prepare for the possibility of political and social upheaval. So whether you're a security professional, a law enforcement officer, or just someone who wants to understand the future of our country, this is a conversation you don't want to miss. But before we do that, whatever platform you're listening or watching on, please subscribe and hit that bell notification so you don't miss another episode. And also, if you'd like access to exclusive member-only content, consider becoming a premium subscriber on our Substack account. I'll put the link at the bottom of the page. For the price of less than one of those number 2 meals at McDonald's, you can get exclusive member-only content straight to your inbox, and it won't make you fat. All right, so without further ado, we're talking about Civil War 2.0 with Mike Shelby. It's on the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, and we're starting right now. Welcome back to another episode of the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast. It's the show that gives you the tips and tools you need to make yourself faster, stronger, and harder to kill. As always, recorded live from a undisclosed location south of the Mason-Dixon line. I am joined by an just overwhelmingly stellar dude, Mike Shelby from Forward Observer. Mike, thanks for coming on the show. How are you?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'm doing well. Thanks for inviting me on your podcast.
Awesome, man. Well, I've referenced your work a lot in other podcast episodes that we've done. But for those who don't follow you or are really familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit of background and what it is that you do?
Sure. Well, I dropped out of college in 2003 and enlisted in 2004. I was a all-source intelligence analyst, 96 Bravo for all the Black Boot Army guys.
Oh, yeah.
And then I did that for several years and got into contracting, spent over 3 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then by 2012, I really had enough. So I got out and I just I screwed around for a little while. I was a fly fishing guide in Wyoming.
Yeah.
But I really felt the draw back to intelligence. And then so 2016, like 2015, 2016 hit, and I started checking these dudes out. They call themselves Antifa. And I started reading up on them. And I was like, and then they started like beating up Trump supporters. And I was like, I got to really start taking a look at these guys. And then that kept me plenty busy. And then 2020 hit, and that's kind of what put Forward Observer on the map, I think probably. Yeah.
And so what exactly is Forward Observer? Like, what do you guys do?
Well, we've gone through some changes over the years. So our early warning intelligence report, we've kind of spun that off to its own thing called Early Warning Network. And then today at Forward Observer, I do custom intelligence products, and I'm getting back into training. So teaching intelligence, teaching people how to do this stuff.
Yeah. And I think, over the years, so one thing we do, we're kind of more on the firearms kind of kinetic aspect of training, but I also have an intel background too, besides being an infantry dude. So I always try to sprinkle that stuff in where I can. And that's actually one reason why I started this podcast, because there's a lot of things that I knew that people were interested in, but when they're at a carbine class, you just don't have time to delve off. That's not why they came. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I started the podcast so that I could kind of put some of that back in and pair that with the live event training. But yeah, I see what you're saying. Like, when you get out, and we'll get into it, but there's something you said I wanted to kind of follow up on. Being in the military, especially when you get deployed, I know this was true for me, that like, it sounds kind of cliche. I don't mean to sound verbose, but you do kind of feel like you're a citizen of the world in a sense, because you're traveling around overseas and you're watching the news, and things that you see that are headlines very well can affect your life personally, meaning you could find yourself deployed there, countries you'd never heard of or didn't know anything. And you feel very much a part of the news cycle and as an individual. And then when you get out, it's like immediately that's gone. And I kind of had a weird time dealing with it, because I didn't understand what was going on. Did you experience that at all when you got out?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, my biggest thing was like reading headlines and just being like, that's kind of not true. Or reading headlines and be like, man, that happened like 2 weeks ago. And it's just now like being picked up,
Yeah.
So I guess in a sense, yeah.
Yeah. I got you. All right. Well, let's get on to what we're going to talk about. So I know, when I was a kid growing up, every once in a while, you kind of get wind of these, wild, I guess, underground type news programs and stuff like that. And, they'll talk about New World Order. They'll talk, all this stuff actually that was conspiracy stuff back then that's kind of become mainline now. When you talk about it, people don't look at you like you're crazy, but back in the day they did. But I remember always hearing about things like civil war, like there's a civil war coming. And I just thought, of all the things, like sleeper cells, yeah, that's an easy buy-in. Infiltration by foreign states, yeah, I got that. Everybody's watched James Bond, and yeah, I'm with you on that. But then when people start talking about civil war, I'm like, how is that possible? But I think now that, especially within the last 8 years, I think people are opening up to the possibility, at least open to the possibility, that very much could happen. We just came out of an election cycle, and you and I were talking off air that, like, most people listening to this were Trump supporters, or at least voted for him. And it just seems like a blind side on the right that, if we can just get the right guy in, he's going to come in and fix all these problems and stuff like that. But with the result of the recent election, A, is civil war still on the table? And then B, when we say that word, what does that mean? What does that look like? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we first have to really define what we're talking about when we say the term civil war. So some sort of domestic conflict, yeah, I'd say that's ongoing. Chances that it will continue, I think pretty high. It's not inevitable. So, we can go back to like 2008 and Occupy Wall Street and look at these violent social movements. That's a form of low intensity conflict. So that's been happening for a while. When most people talk about civil war, they're thinking organized political violence, like direct action, force on force type stuff.
Yeah.
Like team sports.
Yeah.
Organized murder.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say it's not impossible for the United States, but I really look at violent social movements and terrorism. I think is far more likely, like an actual insurrection. I think is far more likely than than like the U.S. military getting involved. And listen, here's the other thing too: when we define civil war, it really depends whose definition you use.
Yeah,
the academic definition of civil war has, I think, like four components. Number one, it's an armed conflict that involves the government as a belligerent. So a gang war, two gangs fighting each other, is a domestic conflict maybe, but it's not a civil war. Number two is military involvement. Number three is action on both sides. So a genocide is not a civil war. So both sides have to be shooting at each other.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is like 1,000 related deaths, 1,000 combat deaths within a calendar year. And, we kind of use that term, and that's a little bit more difficult for me to see right now because the temperature's been turned way down. So is civil war, something like that, still on the table? Yeah, I think it is, but we need a lot of accelerators of conflict to happen before we get to a trigger point like that.
Yeah. So that's good that you bring it up as defining your terms. I think we hear these things like insurrection, we hear insurgency, we hear civil war. And I think everybody, I think average Joe on the street could use that in a sentence, but I doubt most people have really sat and thought through what the term means in depth. You know what I mean? Most people, like, you could say civil war, and you because you've researched it and thought of those definitions, you come up with that, and then other people would think, North and the South. That's their only frame of reference. And so when they conjure a mental image of what that means, that's what's going to pop in their head, and they're like, yeah, I don't think we're there. But yeah, civil war can mean other things. So you said insurgency is maybe more likely. What is an insurgency?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're talking about low intensity conflict, and that goes from everything from violent social movements, like I would say BLM in 2020 was a violent social movement, up to guerrilla campaigns, separatist guerrilla campaigns, popular revolutions. I think 2020 broadly was probably an attempted popular revolution against Trump, and then the top of that is insurgency. So low intensity conflict is beneath the threshold of conventional war. So we don't have tanks and bombers shooting at each other, not tanks and not bombers, but above routine peaceful competition. So that spans a number of different types of conflicts. Insurgency is an armed conflict. It's an armed attempt to overthrow a government. And that could be a federal government or a national government. That could be a state government or a provincial government. So, I guess that's kind of like the DOD version of insurgency.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take that, where you're saying, hey, something like that is possible, but you also mentioned that the temperature has kind of been dialed way down for right now. So let's kind of go back, because I think it's top of mind of everybody. I think we can still remember the, summer of love, mostly peaceful, type things that were going on during the summer, and just kind of a lot of upheaval, really kind of building to something, right? And then so we had Biden take over, and that kind of seemed to quell things. And so now, as we had the run up to the most recent election, there were a lot of folks, except for you, that were saying, oh, the Antifa, the BLM, there's going to be these, everybody was getting ready for like some kinetic event to happen if Trump took the White House, and it didn't. And you were one of those that were very vocal to tell everybody, hey, calm down, because the indicators just aren't there. The same infrastructure is not there. So can you kind of walk us where we were and where we are right now? And then once you get done with that, I'll ask you where you think it's going.
Well, I think the expectation that the left would revolt again, that we would have riots or something worse, I think that's kind of it was a rational expectation coming out of 2020. But I don't think it was a logical expectation. And the big part of that is because we had not seen a lot of action out of the far left since 2021. So you have I call it Floyd's Rebellion, somewhat tongue in cheek, but you have Floyd's Rebellion really ending in earnest, kind of like mid 2021. And then there's not much of anything happening. There's like a handful of things. There's Jane's Revenge, which they went and firebombed a bunch of pro-life facilities after the Roe v. Wade SCOTUS case. There was a few others. Most recently, there was the pro-Palestine stuff. But, I just took a look around at it. Nobody's kneeling for Palestine. The cops are not kneeling. Politicians are not kneeling for Palestine. And then I started looking at what law enforcement was doing in these cities. And they were not allowing these guys room to riot. These Antifa type folks, the direct action, the black blocs, they were being disrupted and they were being followed and then arrested. And so I just look at I think if you're looking at early warning indicators of a conflict, you have to take the social temperature, because low intensity conflict is a type of social warfare. It's political, psychological. It's very social. And so I just looked around, and it was very obvious to see that the temperature was just not turned up enough to launch something like that. And a revolution is not something you cold start. So when I look at conflict, I'm looking at three things. Number one, fault lines. So what are the major disagreements that people would actually fight over? In 2020, it was racial. but it could be religious, it could be ideological, political, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then next is accelerators of conflict. So you have a social base that is armed or preparing for war or has some expectation of war. So that's kind of the first big indicator I'm looking at. Is the social base arming in anticipation of armed conflict? And we didn't have that this last time around in 2024. And then you move to accelerators of conflict. And we have this pot of water that's on the stove. And these accelerators of conflict turn the temperature up. So one accelerator of conflict could have been inflation, because that makes people angry. It induces economic hardship. People are looking for alternatives. But that really wasn't moving the needle. That was not an accelerator of conflict. And you look at the media, and I didn't see the media accelerating that type of domestic conflict. And so all the things that we saw in 2015, 2016, all the way up into 2020, I just didn't see. There's no recession. So large numbers of young people were not, they had stuff to do. They had work, they had school, whatever.
Yeah.
So basically there was just not, the social base was just not big enough. There were no accelerators of conflict. And then if there is a trigger event, that's the third thing I'm looking at: social base or fault lines, accelerators, and triggers. If we had a trigger event, there was nothing to trigger. There's no pressure built up in the system. That's really what accelerators do, right? We have this pot of water, it turns the temperature up, we get to a low boil, and then we get this active boil, and then a trigger event causes the pot to explode. And we just weren't boiling. And that's the biggest thing. And also too, I look at far left stuff every day. It's the first thing I do when I get into the office. They just weren't active. Their networks have atrophied from a lack of use. There was no street movement, nothing like that. I think a big accelerator of conflict was the presence of right-wing groups like Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Those groups aren't doing marches. There was no rallies anymore. So there's really nothing at the street level for these essentially street gangs to react to. So I just basically, in a very condensed sentence, there was a lack of indicators that drove 2016 to 2020 in 24.
Okay. So, well, let me kind of go back to a couple things that you said. So you said, like, in some of these areas, law enforcement, it's almost like they kind of had enough, and they were starting to be more aggressive and the roundup and breaking up the protests if they were, or kind of nipping it in the bud before it spun out of control. So that was something that was different in a sense. And I guess because during the Summer Love and mostly peaceful protests, there were cities where your city leaders are going out marching with the people that are burning down their cities. In the city, the mayor controls the police, right? Chief of police answers to him. And you have that. And then now you have this switch where now all of a sudden that's not the case anymore. They're rounding the guys up. They're making arrests. They're prosecuting these people. What do you have? I mean, it's almost like someone pushed a button or flipped the script. Like, what is your theories on that?
Well, I don't even know where to start. All right. So back in 2020, George Soros, and I hate to even bring him up, but he was, I think it was a Financial Times interview or something. I forget where I read this, some financial publication. And he said the election is 10 months away, and that's an eternity in a revolutionary situation. So, this is something that he clearly understood. And I think that's important. You say flip a switch, and it was. I mean, it was like someone just pressed a button and that stuff disappeared. So I'm not saying it was George Soros, but for the city leaders, I think the average city dweller got tired of their businesses and their streets being ransacked every night through these riots. So I don't know, Mark, that's like a big question for me. I don't have, financial crimes desk here. So, I wish I did. I wish I could follow the money. And you know what, maybe some super sleuth online could start opening up, like, I'm not saying it's USAID either, but
Yeah.
I haven't followed the money, so I don't know who flipped the switch off. But the biggest thing is I think it outlived its usefulness. Biden won, Trump lost. That's it. We don't need him anymore. Turn him off.
Yeah.
I think that you're right. I think that's what happened.
Yeah. So it just kind of burned itself out for now, kind of, in a way.
Well, Trump was the biggest, I would say, not Trump, opposition to Trump was the biggest driver. The quote unquote anti-fascist movement was the biggest driver. And when you don't have a quote unquote fascist to rail against anymore, like, what do you do? I mean, I guess you go back home and play video games or something.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, and again, like you, I mean, I don't have, my fingers in like all these, clandestine sources that are feeding me information. I'm just kind of looking at the news and things that I read and just trying to piece things together the best I can. But, I've read and looked at stuff like that's put out by like Peter Turchin and Gladstone and some of those guys, even dudes that you reference on your show a lot. And, that idea, and I think even on one of your podcasts or your episodes, I think you even talked about this, where you kind of set it straight that, these revolutions or these uprisings and stuff, they're often presented in the media as being a grassroots kind of thing, but it's rarely that. A lot of times there's elites at the top that are driving this. And so to me, it looked like some of these elites kind of jumped ship from a left lean, lending supports to left wing kind of. Well, the greatest one would be Elon Musk, right? I mean, I think he had a huge effect just by taking over Twitter and having some kind of information network that, Trump and those that are on the right could get their message out, because the other side would do their usual tricks or whatever when they put out their media talking points or whatever. And whereas in the last cycle, there wasn't a really good way to counter that. But with the advent of X, there was a signal that you could almost, it's almost like they could get out ahead of every story. It seemed that way to me. But I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How heavy, like, the interplay of, and maybe we can talk about that, elite and counter elite competition kind of changed the results of what everybody was expecting.
Well, yeah, I mean, Elon Musk. Well, here's where I'd start. The left is not a monolith. It is just like, just like the right. The left has its various factions and its various motivators and goals and objectives. So when I look at 2020, sure, there was BLM. Okay, there was the racial element, and I would say even like Marxist element. And then you also have even the anti-fascist, quote unquote anti-fascist umbrella was progressives. It was progressive elites, and then it was far left. It was the revolutionary left. And the progressive elites want to reform the government. They don't want to topple the government. They want to take it over. They don't want to kill the host. They want to control the host, like the parasites they are. And then you have the revolutionary left, like the revolutionary anarchists. And they actually do. They don't want to reform government. They're abolitionists. They want to abolish all forms of hierarchy. So abolish the government, abolish all forms of capitalism, all forms of oppression, abolish the police, abolish prisons, so on and so forth. That's not something that the progressive elites want to do. I don't think. The progressive faction of the left.
Right.
And so like the internationalist, globalist type faction.
Yeah.
And so so when we talk about elites in intra-elite conflict, I'm really talking about that establishment elite. The internationalists, the progressive, the neoliberal. We'll kind of call them all neoliberal establishment. And so what happens in intra-elite conflict is you have not only disagreement among the elite class, you have a fracturing of the elite class. And I think that is exactly what has happened since 2016, since Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is an elite. But he had such a differing vision for the country from the establishment. That's why they hate him so much. And that's probably why they tried to kill him and tried to throw him in jail and try to do all these other things.
Yeah.
So today we have this fracturing of elites, this a break in consensus. And now we have the elite, the establishment elite, and the counter elite. And I look at guys like Elon Musk. For a while, I was kind of on the fence of Elon Musk. Like, I think he is an opportunist, but I also think his son being transed, I think that red pilled him. And so I would probably say, yeah, he's a member of the counter elite, but also guys like Thiel and some of the other folks. The people who realized that the future of the United States that the elites had in mind is not the one they wanted. And so we have these two irreconcilable visions for the future. And that is what caused a breakdown in the elite consensus. One that wants more freedom, and then one that wants, quote unquote, mud democracy. So I think that's what's happened. I think Trump triggered that.
Yeah. So when you talk about like these intra-elite competition, right? I mean, you look at, depending on what side of the aisle you're on, right? There's going to be elites that are running things and are active on both sides. So however you clarify your politics or whatever side you kind of lean to, you're going to have some type of elite structure that's running those things. And I kind of lost my train of thought, but I guess what I was trying to say is, yeah, I do see that. What you're saying is that it's not a monolith. I think there's a lot of people that kind of, I don't know, for some reason, they seem like there's this, some people subscribe to this like theory of a global cabal that's like like the Davos group, that's just like this unified monolith that are just kind of pulling the levers of power globally and everything. And, even within, and I don't think that's true. I'm like with you. I think there's several splits within those entities that are vying for power, just like you would see in the Chinese Communist Party. There's one party, there's one power structure, but even within that, there's dudes that want to rise to power and that have different visions on where to take China or any type of totalitarian, power structure, right? And I think that's probably more accurate to look at things that way and to see that these guys do fracture. They pit each other, certain groups against the other, and things like that. And I would definitely agree with you. That's probably a better. Oh, and I know where I was going. And so, do you think though that? So for those who are happy that Trump won, they're like, oh, okay, well, these guys are elites, but hey, they are looking out for me. They're adopting these agendas and these things that resonate with me because we're on the same page. Do you see it that way, or do you see it as they're really guys that are switching sides just for more self-serving purposes, and that they could switch? They could just as Peter Thiel or those other guys that used to be kind of liberals, or I'm not so sure about. I don't know as much about Thiel, but let's take Elon Musk, who used to be a liberal. Now he's kind of on this side, but could you see those guys like switching over? And again, if the tides was right.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I look at guys like Elon Musk and Bill Ackman also. He's a hedge fund guy. And Bill Ackman, I think, is Jewish, and he was just disgusted by the left's embrace of Palestine and their quasi defense of Hamas. And so I think you do get some of those people that say the left was going too far, and the left, there's all these polling, there's all these surveys and polls that say the progressive Democrats are going way too far than their base. And their base is still probably like mostly center left, social safety net type progressives. They are not trans your kids and have 47 genders type people. Yeah. At least. So I don't know. I think people just saw that and just said, well, the left, it went way too far left. And if the left moderates, then maybe probably the center left elite. Like I think Elon Musk is socially, at least, he continues to say he's center left. Maybe he's not now because people evolve. But absolutely. I can see the Bill Ackmans and the other people going back to Democrats if Democrats adopt some sane social policies.
Yeah. Yeah. So, all right. So we've talked about, putting things kind of in a context of insurrection and groups, power groups that are at work, and, why things didn't just, come unraveled when Trump won the election. It was pretty quiet. It was interesting because my next question is going to be like, what do you forecast next? Like, where are we going? Because theoretically, those groups are still there. Maybe they've atrophied, but the groups are still there. The interests are still there. Yeah. Well, let's just hit that. Where are we now, and where do you see things going that people should be kind of watching?
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple of things concern me when I look at the state of the left, and they really are in disarray. And even Democrats have said this publicly, like James Carville and lots of other of the Democrat establishment types. So I think a lot of it hinges on two things. Number one is what the Democrats do. The Democrats have obviously lost their support. Mm-hmm. There's a poll that was even on CNN. It said like Americans' approval rating of the Democrat Party is like 38% or something like that. Okay. Well, no wonder they got swept out of power. Mm-hmm. The Democrats are gunning for the midterms. They say we have to stop Republican majorities in the House and the Senate. If Democrats are able to do that in the midterms, and I think that's a big if, then I don't know. I think maybe they set up a situation where Trump, I don't know. In short, I don't know. If Democrats are not able to do that and they're staring down 2 more years of, I think in 2 years, the Supreme Court will almost certainly have ruled on the constitutionality of the Impoundment Act and also ruled on whether these lower federal court judges are able to stop the executive branch policies. Mm-hmm. And Trump wants to escalate both of these cases to the Supreme Court. So if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Trump administration and Democrats are unable to break the Republican majority and they're facing 2 more years, I don't know. It's kind of tough to say. I think at a certain level, they're still in the wilderness, and I think they do have to start over. There's just not enough popular support to launch anything major like that.
Yeah.
But here's my biggest concern is the economy.
Yeah.
It is inflation, and it is there's a lot of mixed economic data right now. And if we do go through some economic turbulence, a financial crisis, I really do think we're probably like one crisis away from that center majority of America, or not majority, but that center kind of plurality maybe of America. I think that's where the support comes from. Right now, I think they're supporting Trump. If they were ever to oppose Trump because President Trump would get blamed for a financial crisis or for a recession or something like that, then I think the left would have maybe a lot more opportunity. They would have a greater opportunity to win support for their left-wing causes. Mm-hmm. So kind of the two things. I mean, I think Democrats are probably in the driver's seat in a lot of this about what they want to do and what they want to stand for, and then the economic health. Because you go back and you read through periods of intra-elite conflict, which historically lead to state breakdown and civil wars. Inflation and economic conditions are probably the largest accelerator of that type of conflict. So maybe it kind of, if Trump can actually, if the Trump revolution can actually remake the federal government without, here's my big problem. There's so much evidence that U.S. economic growth is due to federal spending. And what happens when you nuke federal spending? Do you nuke economic growth? And if that's the case, then we're probably in for a difficult rest of this decade.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me, if we haven't blown too far past that topic, there was something interesting that no one had it really, I saw it posed on a few journalists' Twitter feeds, but nobody really had a good answer for it. So going back to the election, even though there wasn't any rioting, really wide scale rioting and burning things down when Trump got the nomination, and but you definitely had your usual suspects kind of double downing on the propaganda pieces. He's a dictator, he's a Nazi, he's this and that. Just really trying to spin that that constituency up to maybe take action is what it looked like to me, but just wasn't that effective. But I remember even, I think it was even Obama was tweeting, hey, these elections nowadays, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, hey, we may not know who the winner is for a couple weeks. There were even certain states, battleground states, saying, hey, it might take weeks before we know this. And for the more cynical of us, it's hard not to think, oh yeah, that's so you could cook the books, and they had 4 years, if you are a person that thinks that the prior election was stolen, and I know people go both ways on that, but we know that there is improprieties in every election and everything like that. And so they definitely had 4 years to do that. They were telegraphing in advance that, hey, we're not going to get yourself ready. We're not going to know who the winner is on November 7th or, when the election was. And then lo and behold, that night, everybody seeded the election. There weren't really any big contests. I mean, I know there were still like Arizona and a couple states that like were late in disclosing, who they called the election for. But on the whole, it was just very quiet, very anticlimactic. And you would have figured that these guys, if they were, wanting to hold on to power, they had 4 years to fix the issue, so to say. And I don't know, what would you did you find that strange? And if so, what would you attribute that to?
Yeah, I did find that strange. What I found strange is I stayed up all night or most of the night following the election on election night, looking at those 19 bellwether counties.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember those?
Yeah.
Basically, since 1980 or something like that, they've correctly predicted every single presidential candidate except for 2020, when it was like 17 of 19 counties went for Trump, but Biden won. And I just said, I don't know. I'm an intelligence analyst, but I can identify a red flag when I see one.
Yeah.
So yes. And then but Nate Silver and all these demographers and the political pundits said, well, you have to understand, these counties are changing demographically, and there's a perfectly reasonable explanation why these bellwether counties, and it's just complete BS.
Yeah.
Because I stayed up and counted, and it was like 17 or 18 out of the 19 bellwether counties broke for Trump, and he won this time.
Yeah.
So at any rate, I was somewhat shocked because my big concern was that, Obama had 8 years to build this large moat, and Trump defied all the odds and he won. And then maybe 24 was too big to rig. I don't know. I think there was just such a large expectation. I mean, really, if you're trying not to kill the hope, I don't know. I think Democrats were probably just put in a very tough, and I say Democrats, I think the establishment elites were probably just put in a really tough spot. And now they get to go home and lick their wounds and bitch and moan and cry about it and try to rebuild. I don't think they could have stolen this election again. I think they did. I mean, obviously they stole it through the courts in Pennsylvania and Michigan through mail-in ballots and stuff, but I don't think they could do that again.
Okay. So let's, if we can, so we've talked about the domestic front. I know you cover like world events too and everything. And so what are you seeing as far as the hot spots? I mean, do you think it's so strange? It's like, it's almost like the news cycle is completely different now since Trump took office, because beforehand it was all I was hearing was civil war, societal collapse, World War III. And then now, we're talking about other stuff. It's like he's on this blitzkrieg, man, of like all these executive orders and like deportations and Doge and maybe that's what it is. It's just sucking up all the oxygen from the room. But I mean, those conflicts are still there. Are there anything that you're seeing that's concerning to you? Looks like there's a shot for Ukraine to wind down. Maybe. What are you thinking as far as on the global events?
Yeah, I just want to go back real quick. I'm not saying that Trump is a political savior and that he's going to go in and fix everything. We still have $36 trillion worth of debt. We still have a massive deficit. Trump, if he's lucky, has less than 2 years. He's got till the 26 midterms. And even then he's got to fight some Republicans on some of this stuff. So, this is a decades long, a problem that's taken decades or maybe even a century and a half to make. And you don't fix that in 2 to 4 years.
Yeah.
So I think we still have massive problems post-Trump. I'm somewhat optimistic that maybe we we can change our trajectory. So, then I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that one thing, and then I forgot your last question.
Oh, no problem, man. We kind of go wherever you want on it. But I was just kind of talking about on the global scale, there was a lot of talk, pre the election about World War III and all these hot spots. And now there's not as much in the news cycle, but do you still see that as conflict simmering kind of in the distance?
Yeah, it's pretty clear that Trump wants to be the peace and prosperity president. And he told Israel and the Gazans and, wind it down before I get into office. And he told that to Russia and Ukraine, wind it down. And now he's prepared to give 20 or 30% or 20% of Ukraine to Russia. And I don't know, recognize that. I don't want to get embroiled in this debate if it's Russia or Ukraine. However,
right.
I think just make some Ukrainian concessions to end the war, because it's really in nobody's best interest. I think it was an avoidable war.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I am hopeful that Trump not only wants to be, but also will be a peace and prosperity president. And I hope, but we still have the problem of China, and we still have the trade war with China. And, I'm concerned about China's in a precarious situation because it's like 16% of Chinese exports go to the United States. So there will be, China will not be crippled if they do get into some massive trade war, I think, with the United States. We could be. So, there's just so much of our critical manufacturing that still not only takes place in China. It's like we get 20% of our imports or something like that from China, 40% from the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
And so if trade is disrupted across the Indo-Pacific, then that's just a lot of hurt for Americans.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm just, I think the Trump strategy is wind down Ukraine, give that problem to Europe, cross your fingers. Hopefully they don't start a world war they're not able to fight, because they're not.
Yeah.
And maybe keep things cool in the Middle East, and then focus on making war against China without actually going to war, which I think is China's strategy too.
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem that way. Do you kind of subscribe to Peter Zeihan's, theories about like globalism is ending, that, a lot of that manufacturing is going to come back here to America, Canada, Mexico, and Japan, that, if I recall right, he kind of sees them as part of that American trade bloc, and that things are, and I'm not an expert on his theories. I've read a book or two of his. One thing about him, and you might disagree with this. I mean, I don't have the expertise that he does, but when I listen to him and when I read him, I mean, it seems like he's always got his facts right, but I'm just not sure about the conclusions that he draws, because he's been talking about China, like any minute China's going to go back to, to the horse and cart pretty soon, that they're just on the verge of collapse. And I mean, he's been saying that for, I think, 10 years or whatever, that it's just like any day now. And I guess, just like any Nostradamus prediction, man, you give it long enough, and I mean, chances are it's going to come true, 100 years from now, 200 years from now. But I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think we're deglobalizing? Do you see that at all?
I think we are. Yeah, I think we are. This whole decoupling or quote de-risking process. Yeah, I think that's part of deglobalization. And I look at China wants I don't think they don't want to replace the dollar. They want to displace the dollar through like 20 to 40% of the world in the global South and the BRICS countries. I don't think they're going to be able to do it. And you look at this stuff that the Fed has been doing, creating this kind of somewhat artificial shortage of dollars. And I don't know what's going on with gold, but I haven't even looked into it yet. But there's something maybe going on with gold. And I think it really is all aimed at forcing these countries to stay on the dollar system, which China is trying to disrupt. They're talking about this BRICS currency. And I don't think half of those countries can't even run their own currency very well. How are they going to run a global currency? So, so anyway, I think that's China's trying to replace all these international institutions that are, quote unquote, a Western led rules based order. I mean, they are. And I think the Trump administration, I think they're realists, and I think Marco Rubio is a realist. And like NATO, I think they just say we have to let some of these vestigial organizations, these like these post World War II order, we have to let some of them decay because they're obsolete or they don't serve us anymore. And so I really see Trump and company trying to forge maybe like a new global order that's not ruled by the West, but kind of still managed, maintained by the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. I've talked to people that are kind of in Fortune 100 companies and stuff like that. Cause I was like, hey, is this, that do business with China and India and those, and I was like, is that really a thing? I mean, are we really decoupling and starting to bring manufacturing and stuff down here? And they've said, oh yeah, I mean, it's just so, especially after, the lockdown and everything. And when people realize just how fragile that global supply chain network is, that it's got to, just from a business standpoint, it's got to be brought back to a more secure area where things are accessible. And that's kind of, I think, Peter Zion's kind of take. But I think, he would admit that, that's not something that's going to happen overnight. And it's not something that's without pain, that it's going to take a few years in transition. I think that kind of also maybe could explain some of this, why certain elites decided to maybe jump ship and maybe move their affiliations politically to different segments, just because, you've got the Soros crowd that's like open borders, total globalists, to other groups that, don't see that as a upside, and that maybe some of that power and funding, right, shifting away to, something that's maybe a little bit more pro-America, I guess.
Hey, can I go back to this Xeon thing real quick?
Yeah.
I read a couple of his books, but the one that came out in 22 or so, The End of the World is Just the Beginning.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is.
I read, that's the one I read.
It was an interesting book. It was a very interesting book, very thought provoking. And I thought one of the most important, critical to understand predictions that Xeon made is that the United States' ability to maintain a global military presence is coming to an end, and that the United States is going to be forced back into the Western Hemisphere because we're not going to be able to afford it anymore. And the second, or by now probably third, fourth, fifth order effect is that we're going to enter into a new age of piracy, because China doesn't have a blue water navy to secure all of its supply lines across the ocean, and so this is going to essentially lead to like taxes or fees. If you want to go through, if you want to transport your goods down the coast of Africa, or, through their waters, then you're going to have to, pay them because they're the ones keeping the pirates out. Whatever. That was basically his argument. I thought that was very interesting, because when the United States can no longer maintain a global military presence, we will no longer be, I think the United States is an empire. And some people say, well, republic heading into an empire. Other people say, well, we're an empire heading into collapse. And I don't, who knows what comes next. Right. So, but I mean, I think either one of those, I think there's an argument to be made for that. But I think that's one of Xeon's greatest predictions, just in terms of importance. The American empire is coming to an end, and that's going to change how we all live our lives. If the dollar does get and I don't think it's anytime soon, but we're talking about decades here. Like my kids are my age. They may be living in under a whole different government if we want to go down that road.
Yeah. I mean, continue on. What do you think that could look like?
Well, I'm pretty split on whether America is a republic and we're about to become an empire, or whether America is an empire that is collapsing. I think you go back to Samuel Huntington, and even back in the 90s, he said the United States is in a period of absolute and relative decline relative to Asia, China specifically. And so, yeah, I think he was right in the 1990s. I mean, I think that's still right now. There's a lot of history that says America is probably in the process of collapse.
Mm.
I'm maybe not 100% on that, obviously. And I think Trump is kind of this wild card, and maybe if they can somehow change the trajectory, but our previous trajectory was absolutely not only decline, but I think it was collapse. And you can go into Sir John Glubb, and he talks about the 250-year lifespans, and Rain Tagapera said roughly 2.65 centuries, which is from birth to peak to collapse of an empire, really close to Glubb's 250 years. And you just you go back through all these histories. And Peter Churchin talks about this also.
Yeah.
And so I guess my bottom line is I think Trump kind of changes some things. But I said earlier, Trump's not going to fix this in 2 to 4 years. And we may end up fighting a civil war over the 2028 election. I don't know. So, here's the thing that causes me the greatest concern, Mark, is we sit back from November to January. I sat in on dozens of strategy calls for these Democrat progressive groups, and they're going all in on the 7 swing states. They said Harris lost the swing states. If she had just won 4 out of the 3, Harris would be president. And they said that's where the fight is. And the big thing is pushing the election of Democrat majorities in these state houses, in these 7 swing states, because the state houses will be in charge of the rules of the election. And so, it's a little bit concerning for me for Democrats to say, well, we got to be in charge in these elections in the swing states because they determine who the president will be in after the 28 elections. So, I mean, that it's still a big unknown to me, but I don't see why the 28 elections would be any less cantankerous as the previous few election cycles.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what happens? No, I mean, but really though, what happens? And I don't even know if it's realistic for Democrats to do this kind of 180 in less than 2 years. But let's say they do. I mean, let's say we get like another 2020 thing where a state Supreme Court decides the outcome of an election, and the views are so diametrically opposed to each other. You have this establishment elite candidate and the counter elite candidate, and the election is undetermined, or there's some substantial doubt. I mean, who's going to hang around for people to take this country back 180 degrees from where we've been going? So I don't know. There's a lot of future there, Mark. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. Well, I guess if we both had a crystal ball, man, and we're 100% on predictions, man, we'd probably be living on a secluded island somewhere, retired and stuff. But it's really interesting, man. It's just so much stuff is up in the air. I'm just kind of reminded there's this old samurai proverb that says, once victory is secured, tighten your helmet cord. You know what I mean? And it's just like, it's like, okay, he won the election. If your guy won the election, that's great. And you got the victory, but now the real struggle is going to happen because I see that like you do too. It's not like, these networks may have atrophied and stuff, but the people that were in the reins of power, it's not like they've stopped wanting what they want. It's not like the further we go down the line, and like you said, things get more cantankerous, then you're constantly fracturing the system, and pulling things apart. And, and it's just like any kind of, anything else, how much stress can that entity take before it does finally collapse, and that's like you said, where, when you have inter-elite competition, just like the 100 Years' War, the English Civil War or whatever, it's like, how much can the system take before it just falls apart from all this infighting, and corruption. And then you add the economic collapse, stresses right on your common people. And pretty soon, I don't know, it's like everybody's, going to line up behind someone, that promises that they can fix it. You know what I mean? It just seems like that's the nature of things.
One other thing, Mark, just briefly about the 28 elections. I think right now, obviously Medicare and Social Security, obviously insolvent. People say, I think GAO says they're going to run out of money in like the 2030s or something. And that is predicated on incorrectly predicated on a couple things. Number one, it's that date does not factor in a potential recession, which would make the problems even worse. It would bump those dates up. It's also predicated on like 7.5% returns in the market. And that's about average.
Yeah.
The problem is Goldman Sachs came out a month or two ago and said, the markets are probably going to return about an average of 3% per year for the next decade.
Yeah.
So that's less than half of what it normally is. And you already have so much pension debt and, we're $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. If we do have a recession by the end of this decade or maybe prior to 28, this election is going to be about how to deal with those problems. And that may be the only issue on voters' minds, how to deal with how to deal with the problems. But I think that I look at that and I just say a financial crisis could trigger worsening intra-elite conflict because both parties are going to have completely separate ideas about what to do. And the way that and again, historically intra-elite conflict leads to state breakdown and civil war. And so the problem, that I would see happening is Social Security and Medicare, and maybe we have much worse fiscal and financial problems, not in the 2030s, but in 2027, 2028. And so this election is just massive. It's like every election since 2008 was the most important of our lifetimes,
right.
Whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that is true.
Yeah.
So, where I was going with that, the way you solve intra-elite conflict is there has to be some kind of reconciliation among elites. I don't see that happening. And so the problem is in these intra-elite conflicts, one side attacks the monopoly. The establishment has the monopoly on power, which the establishment elite has. They have had political and cultural dominance. And the counter elite attacks that monopoly on power, which Trump has. And I think he's in the process now of locking out the establishment elite power over government. And that's not reconciliation. That's potential defeat.
Yeah.
And so where I'm really going with this is that's pretty concerning to me because I think I don't know. I guess my big question is, will parts of the military, will we start to see, I don't know, it's kind of an unformed conclusion here, but just speaking off the top of my head, what happens when you have two presidential candidates, because Trump can't run again, but two presidential candidates who refuse to lose the election, and all the fears that we've had from 2016 and what happens in 2020 and what happens in 2024 actually do come to fruition in 28. That's why I'm a lot more concerned about 28. I don't care about 2025 or 26, but the 28 elections I'm very concerned about.
Yeah. Yeah. It is, it's crazy. What? So,
it's not just that maybe you have two sides claiming they won. You have two completely polarizing candidates because they have very diametrically opposed, right? Yeah. This is not just two flavors of the same establishment candidate. This is the elite establishment candidate versus the counter elite candidate. And whoever wins for the next 4 years is going to completely trounce the other side.
Yeah.
Which is what I think the Trump administration is trying to do now. He's just completely trying to disintegrate the left's power and hold over government. Can I just say one more thing here?
No, please. Yeah, continue.
This goes back to John Boyd's concept of grand strategy. And he said, grand strategy is the effort to connect yourself to as many lines of support and power centers as possible and disconnect your opponent from as many lines of support and power centers as possible. And this is exactly what the left has been doing for decades. And the right has been kind of going along to get along. And now all of a sudden we have a figure in the Republican Party. We have a figure on the right who says, no, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to connect ourselves to as many power centers as possible and disconnect you from as many power centers as possible. And that's not a political issue now. Some existential issue. And it's another reason why I'm maybe a little more concerned about 28.
Yeah. So, all right. So those are some grim data points, to be looking at, but it's reality. So if someone's sitting at home, it's like, yeah, I don't think stockpiling 12 cases of tuna fish and, 10,000 rounds of 5.56 in the basement is, I'm not saying don't do that, but that's not probably a viable long-term strategy, to navigate these waters. So what are you thinking, like, for the folks at home? Like, all right, so you've seen the forecast. Like, how do you prepare to navigate these uncertain times?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the focus is on sustainment. Buy enough ammo and food and water and bug out bags and pack enough crap in my bug out bag. And that's sustainment. The problem with sustainment is that it doesn't solve any underlying issues. It gets you into tomorrow, which is important. You've got to have sustainment, but it's not really, it's not really a strategic advantage. At best, maybe it's operational advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And so, really, I everything has to start with an area study, because we're really concerned about 6 different things. Well, we'll boil it down to 4 things: threats and hazards. It doesn't matter if we get into a civil war, we have a stock market crash, hyperinflation, EMP war with China, Russia, Iran, North Korea all at the same time. Doesn't matter. You're going to be affected by the things that surround you. So if you don't understand your operational environment, if you don't understand local threats and hazards, then you're probably not prepared for them.
Yeah.
And then the other side is assets and resources. So who are the people that surround you, and which do you have veterans? I would say key personnel. The veterans, the doctors, the nurses, the engineers, et cetera, the people that are going to keep your world spinning at the local level. Those are your assets. Mm-hmm. And it's not just individuals, it's also groups and subgroups. Mm-hmm. So VFWs and your American Legions and your bears and the lions and tigers and whatever else you got in your area, the social groups, we've got to harness that power.
Yeah.
And so if you want to maintain any kind of stability, right, I say, maintain a first world zone during a third world descent. If you want to do that, that's going to happen at the local level with local people and local groups and local organizations. So you do an area study to identify all those things. So literally, Mark, everything starts with an area study.
Yeah.
And then after that, you've got to build your intelligence network, because this is not a sustainment issue. Now this is like an operational strategic issue. Mm-hmm. Intelligence drives the fight. You got a bunch of guys with guns. That's good. You need intelligence to tell you where to go, when to be there, who to look for, and who to do it to. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and then you've got to have real-time intelligence collection. And if you have those 3 things, I call it broadly area intelligence. If you have those 3 things, then you can identify and start to solve problems at the local level. If you want to maintain a first world zone and a third world descent, it's got to be done through intelligence. So, yeah. So basically what I'm saying is, maybe don't buy that 7th AR-15 and maybe do your area study.
Yeah. And you've written a book on that, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's called the Area Intelligence Handbook.
Okay. I'll make sure I put a link in the show notes before, so that people can find that. Cause I know that's something you push a lot on your show, and we've talked about it in passing, but I would, if you'd be interested, having you come back and maybe do a deeper dive on that
absolutely.
How does someone working a full-time job? Because I think that's one thing that kind of stops people, because they get intimidated, because they're like, I'm working a full-time job, I'm trying to take care of my family, and then I just want to grill a steak and sit down because I'm tired, and then now this dude's telling me I got to take on another full-time job. But I'm sure there's ways to break it down to where it's not as burdensome, because people are doing this. You're teaching people how to do this, and how to incorporate it as a matter of lifestyle, so that it's not like, and also it's not something you're going to do overnight. Like, it's not like someone's like, you had 12 hours to do this. This is something that you do over time and that you refine, I would assume, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it could be a full-time job, but strapping on your ruck or going to the gym is not a full-time job. It's just something that you choose to do because it improves your life. Yeah. And so, intelligence, a lot of intelligence can actually be done passively on the collection side. It can be. I think it's another good reason to get your tribe together, or get your crew, your team, and just say, hey, instead of a range day this Saturday, let's pile up in my living room and let's knock out an area study. And now you got 5 or 6 guys doing an area study. You can knock one out in a few hours. Hey, I don't know when this episode is going to air, but March is National Area Study Month. I always, say that every March. And I'm doing an area study challenge. It's free training. It's 3 days long. It's like 3 sessions long. And I'm going to take everyone through the through the steps on how to get started with your area study, how to build a bare bones area study. You're not going to waste a lot of time. It's teaching. You'll get in. I'll show you what to do. You'll learn how to do it. You do it. And then boom, you got your area study knocked out.
Oh, that's awesome. So this will air before, I'll make sure this, I push this out before March. So how does someone access that if they want to participate in that training?
We'll have a website called areaintelligence.com. And by the time this airs, I'm sure we'll have everything set up. And you just go there, you register, you just give me your email address, and I will email you the session links. And it's 1 to 2 hours a night for 3 nights long. And
wow,
you show up and learn.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's a real service to people. Yeah, we'll definitely make sure we put the word out so that people can take advantage of that, because I think that this stuff, it's not rocket science, but nobody's born knowing how to do it. So just having someone walk you through, I think that's definitely something that's lacking. I think that people are starting to get tuned on to that. I say even in the shooting community, once that kind of became a thing and what it was, and all these people running gun classes, there was this evolution where then people started dialing into, hey, well, if I'm learning how to put holes into somebody, maybe I should learn how to plug them up, like on me or someone. And so, the medical piece got very popular and stuff like that. And it seems like right now, like the communications, I don't know if you know NC Scout, you know him. He kind of made his bread and butter on that. That's getting very popular. People are seeing the need, hey, communication and building your tribe. But I think this too is something that is lacking, and it's just a matter of time before people get dialed in. So being an early adopter, that's the best way to go, to try to get that and put that into your wheelhouse, because that's the problem. We are going into uncertain times. Nobody knows what that's going to look like, but your only antidote to uncertainty is preparation, and having smart preparation. And the area study is definitely, and having an intel network and acumen is, I'm a strong believer in that's essential, every bit as much as knowing how to run a gun, what I mean? Because they say shoot, move, communicate. And then someone said, well, no, it's actually shoot, move, communicate, medicate. And I say, no, it's actually shoot, move, communicate, medicate, inform. Yeah. And for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. I like it. Mike, thank you so much for coming on. We talked about a lot of stuff that I feel like every subtopic could have been its own episode. So I definitely hope you'll come back, and that we can maybe do a little deeper dive on this stuff. So, all right. So I'll put the link to your book and to the upcoming class, but then do you have just your central hub website that you'd like to point people to, or wherever people can best find you?
Yeah. If we do a daily intelligence report and briefing over at earlywarningnetwork.com. That's a really good place to start if you want to see our analyst perspective. And our big thing is, as the name implies, early warning. We're doing trend analysis. We're kind of telling people where the puck is going rather than reporting that it's already there. And then forwardobserver.com, or just check me out on YouTube. I'm starting to make regular YouTube videos. So it's just Forward Observer on YouTube. That's a really good place to start.
Yeah, man, I'm sorry not to open up another topic, but I'll just say this. I'll just commend you on that, because that's one thing I really like about the work that you do, because there's so many news outlets or commentators and guys out there that are telling you where the puck is. No one's telling you where the puck's going. And I think that's how you differentiate yourself from a lot of good channels that are putting out good information. But I think ultimately that's what people need to know is, like, where do we see this going? Because that's the only way you can kind of get ready for it. So highly recommend you and your site. So stay on the line if you would. So make sure that this all buffers. And then, hey, thanks for joining us. On behalf of Mike, thank you again. And I'm Mark, telling you to stay sharp and keep it Pearl Snap.